I wonder what is the worst misunderstanding you've ever found yourself caught up in. I think the time I got two clients mixed up and congratulated the wrong one on her pregnancy was probably the low point for me. Misunderstandings can be funny. Often they just lead to much ado about nothing. For example, Ronnie Barker asked for 4 candles. Ronnie Corbett gave him 4 candles, and Ronnie Barker waited patiently for his 4 candles. Buzz Lightyear is still convinced after all these years that he is a space ranger and not a toy. Paddington Bear saw the dogs must be carried sign, thought that was compulsory, and went and found an obliging pooch. But the consequences of misunderstanding, we know full well, can be very serious. Misread medical charts, a navigational error at sea, a misheard air traffic communication. The dangers of a wrong understanding speak for themselves. So I wonder this morning if you noticed in our Bible reading today the important connection between these two famous events, the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water. Come back with me to verse 51, right at the end of our reading this morning. And Mark writes, "They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened." Which must leave us wondering, what is it that the disciples didn't understand about those loaves? What is it about the loaves that unlocks in some way an accurate understanding of the walking on the water? And I suppose by extension, what is the point that we, Mark's readers this morning, are in danger of missing ourselves or in some way misunderstanding? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are 3 big mistakes that could land us in the same boat as the disciples. In other words, not understanding these 2 miracles. You might be here this morning and you're looking into the Christian faith. If so, that's great. You're really welcome. If you've been with us in the series, then you'll be becoming more familiar with Mark's gospel and his account of the good news about Jesus. But the first mistake we could make here would be to doubt Mark's account of these miracles, to make the mistake of unbelief. Mark intends us to hear his account this morning as we would the evening news, to accept what he describes as fact. He is not writing poetry, fiction, or myth. And if we choose to hear the news like that, well, we are on a fast path to misunderstanding. He's not writing about parables at this point. He did that, remember, back in chapter 4 and made it very clear when he was relaying stories that Jesus told, if you remember, about seeds and a lamp. So this is not this morning about finding the moral of the story in any way. Rather, it's a factual account, imagine it, of thousands of people, high and dry in a real deserted place, and their hungry stomachs were satisfied by the miraculous food that Jesus provided for them. And with that in mind, let's note a couple of things about Mark's account that I think will help us as we work through it. Firstly, just have a look at verses 35 through to 38. Just remind yourselves and spot how Mark gives us all that chat, all that conversation that passed between Jesus and his disciples in the lead up to the feeding miracle. And I wonder why you think he's done that. Well, it's probably to assure us that Mark's source for his report was on the inside of these events, not just a member of the crowd, up close and personal to Jesus. That source is probably the disciple Simon Peter, who we've seen earlier in the series is the likely eyewitness source for Mark's gospel. And it's made clear that it's the disciples who were the ones who brought the problem about it being late and the shortage of food to Jesus. The disciples are the ones who scavenged for the 5 loaves and 2 fish. They were the ones that distributed the miracle food to the crowd. They were close to the action and very well placed to describe what happened. So what we can take from that is that Mark is keen that we notice that the disciples' later failure to understand about the loaves was not because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time and somehow missed the action. These disciples had a ringside seat for what had gone down with the loaves and the fish. And secondly, there's a jarring surprise for us here. Did you notice that the focus of Mark's report is not the content of Jesus' teaching that day? Just take a look at verse 34, the last sentence. So he began teaching them many things. Like what? Tell me more, tell me more. Unlike earlier and later parts of his book, where Mark tells us in great detail the content of Jesus' teaching, here, unusually, we just get that intriguing sentence. It's deliberately provocative, perhaps a little unsettling, as if to alert us that there is a bigger point in Mark's report of these events than even the content of Jesus' teaching that day. It seems Mark is much more concerned for us to understand what Jesus did that day and its implications. So the first mistake we could make is failing to believe what Mark has reported. But another way that we could get these miracles wrong could be because we've become so familiar with them. So the second mistake we could make here would be to miss how amazing these miracles are. I suppose to be underwhelmed by Mark's accounts. You might remember last year media reporting of the Willy Wonka experience in Glasgow, billed as an immersive experience that would be a celebration of chocolate in all its forms. In fact, it left children in floods of tears and parents demanding their money back. A sparsely decorated warehouse, a small bouncy castle, and a smattering of miserable Oompa Loompas left the paying customers feeling decidedly underwhelmed. We can probably think of many occasions where something billed as unique, spectacular, mind-blowing turned out to be something rather less than that. Perhaps we have learnt to be dubious about such claims. I wonder, when was the last time you were really blown away by the sheer power of something? Perhaps on the runway, you're pressed into your seat as your plane accelerates for takeoff. Perhaps you stood by a waterfall and heard the thunderous sound of water cascading over the edge. Perhaps the decibels when a band kicks in at the beginning of a concert, or the big finale. In 1901, the composer Edward Elgar was working on a new composition, and he confided to a friend that he'd written a tune that would knock 'em flat. And he was right. And that piece is still played every year at the last night of the proms. So may I ask you, how did you feel when you heard the Bible passage read this morning? It'd be a huge mistake to be underwhelmed by Jesus' miracles. He multiplied lunchbox food into a quantity that satisfied a crowd of thousands. He walks over the sea faster than those 12 men could row. Come back to me to verse 49. We're back in the boat. The disciples, they see him, they cry out in terror, and they think they've seen a ghost. But Jesus speaks to them saying, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." He gets into the boat and the wind dies down. Because you see, Jesus is with them. The one whose power is such that the ordinary laws of nature simply do not apply. He is not constrained by them. There is no physical obstacle that can stop him. 2,000 years later, the power of these miracles still eclipses our greatest technological and scientific achievements. But I wonder, did you notice something else very obvious about the feeding miracle? It was a very public demonstration of that power. You'll remember, if you've been with us in the Mark series, that on a number of Jesus' earlier miracles, he told the witnesses to stay quiet about what they'd seen. But that day, thousands of people had a shared experience of Jesus' undeniable and glorious power. For each person who was there, surely every sense tingled and testified to the amazing miracle. They saw Jesus give thanks and break the loaves. They saw the disciples distribute the food and gather the leftovers. They heard Jesus teaching, the grumbling of the crowd, the grumbling of their stomachs, and the munching of the food. They touched the loaves and the fish as they took them to eat. They tasted the miracle food as they swallowed. And surely they must have smelt the fish. In every sense, thousands of people experienced Jesus' power that day. They felt it. They participated in it. Deep down, they knew it. And nobody who'd been there could sensibly deny the awesome power that had touched all those hungry people that day. And we need to remember these miracles as we read on in Mark's Gospel. For example, in chapter 14, when Jesus submits to arrest and to false allegations, and especially in chapter 15, when he is abused, mocked, and nailed to a cross. And as he hangs on that cross, the chief priests taunt him to use his power to save himself. Where was the power that Jesus displayed to those thousands of people on the day he hung on a cross? Did he lose that power? Was it taken from him? Or did he choose not to use it? And we'll see as we go on through the next few chapters of Mark in future weeks how Jesus told the disciples in advance about his death and resurrection. He knew full well what awaited him in Jerusalem, and he chose to go. The one who feeds thousands does not need to drink anyone's vinegar. The one who walks on water only hangs on a cross and gives up his life because he chooses to do so. So can we see why it would be such a bad mistake to be underwhelmed by Jesus' power? Because if we don't understand this astonishing day when he displayed that power, we're going to misunderstand an even greater day, the day when he chose not to use it. The day when he displayed his great love for us by giving up his life to save sinners. Now, all that lay ahead for the disciples back in the boat, but they knew what they'd seen and they were awestruck by Jesus' amazing power. So what was it that they'd failed to understand about it? Well, the clue is there in verse 52, right at the end of our reading. Mark tells us their hearts were hardened. And the biggest mistake that we could make when faced with Jesus' power is to be unchanged by it. And that's our last point this morning. Now, we need to look closely at the words Mark uses to describe these miracles, the way he frames the action, his own comments and his interpretation of these events. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A man dressed in black tie gets out of his Aston Martin and walks into a bar. He orders a dry martini. How does he like it? Shaken, not stirred. What's his name? You already know his name long before he says, with a twinkle in his eye, it's Bond, James Bond. And he says that in a Scottish accent if you're over 60. How do we know who this man is? Well, it's because, for better or worse, James Bond has become a part of our shared memory. We recognize instantly the clothes, the car, the drink, and the combination. A man who looks and behaves like that doesn't need any further introduction. And 2,000 years earlier, Mark has done a very similar thing for us, his readers. He is expecting us to recognize some very familiar features in the way he reports these two miracles of Jesus. In fact, Mark's account of the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water is presented in such a way that the memories of not just one but multiple Old Testament scriptures come to mind. And I wonder, did you spot them? Most important is that Mark clearly wants us to understand these miracles in the context of the Exodus. The Exodus, that is, God's great rescue of his people from slavery in Egypt generations before, and how he led them through the wilderness safely to the promised land. This is the great Old Testament story that demonstrated God's covenant love for his people, his awesome power, his protective care of them, and his revelation of himself. Things remembered every day in Jewish prayers and every year at the Passover festival. So I wonder, can we see the connection between the rescue of God's people from Egypt and these two miracles of Jesus? Well, I wonder, did you see Mark repeatedly emphasizing the wilderness location of the first miracle? It's the quiet place of verse 31. It's the solitary place of verse 32. It's the remote place of verse 35. Bang, bang, bang. Have we got the message? Because all of those could be translated as a wilderness. And the obvious connection with the Exodus story is another miraculous feeding of the people who think they're going to starve in the desert. There's a little detail to pick up in verse 41. You see there when we're told that Jesus, in giving thanks, looks to heaven, which many take as a nod towards the heavenly origin of the food. And of course, in Exodus 16, it's recorded how God fed the people in the wilderness with miraculous food, quail and manna. Manna, a heavenly bread that we're told looked like coriander seeds and tasted like a wafer made with honey. It fed them all, fed them for 40 years in the wilderness. The story of the preservation, survival, and ultimate arrival of God's people in the land he promised is tied up with the food that he faithfully provided for them. But what about the miracle on the sea? Well, Jesus trampling over the waters might well remind us of God's amazing power in dividing the Red Sea. You can read about it later in Exodus 14. The waters are parted, God's people go through, and they finally escape their Egyptian slave masters. What about Jesus' words to his terrified disciples in the boat? Just have a look at verse 50. Jesus identifies himself to his friends. He says, "It is I," which could have been translated for us as "I am is here." Surely a reference to God's name revealed to Moses from the burning bush in Exodus 3. And in English, we render that name, "I am that I am," or Yahweh in the Hebrew. What does Jesus say on the water? "I am is here." And if we were left in any doubt, did you know how Mark chose to describe the disciples' misunderstanding in verse 52? It's because of their hard-heartedness. A loaded description, if ever there was one. Mark is deliberately stirring memories of the Pharaoh of Egypt, described as hard-hearted on 20 separate occasions in the book of Exodus. So are we persuaded? Mark is repeatedly inviting us to understand these miracles in the light of that old Exodus story. A story when God spoke plainly to the people about the purpose by which he had fed them with the heavenly food. Why did he feed them? God said to Moses, "At twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you'll be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord, your God." But the extraordinary thing is that Exodus is not the only theme that Mark is playing as he tells us this account. He also wants us to remember a prophet, the prophet Elisha. And in 2 Kings chapter 4, God's prophet Elisha, we read, was brought 20 loaves that he miraculously multiplied to feed 100 people whilst leaving food over. And that may well strike us as a very similar thing to what Jesus did. If you were with us on Sunday evenings in our Elisha series, we'll have seen that many times Elisha points towards Jesus, the Messiah, the one who would save his people. So we mustn't mistake Jesus as just another prophet. Mark is showing us that Jesus is greater than all the prophets who came before in performing a miracle much greater than that of Elisha. But there's another memory stirring. Have a look back to verse 34. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, you might have thought that that's a strange comment by Mark. After all, there clearly weren't any sheep around. If there had been, perhaps there wouldn't have been such a food crisis. And it seems that Mark in that moment wants us to see the crowd through Jesus' eyes, and as if to trigger another memory. In Ezekiel 34, the prophet Ezekiel had condemned the weakness and neglect of the kings of Israel. Kings who were described as leaving the people like sheep without a shepherd. And so the Lord declared that he, the Lord, would be their shepherd and that he would care for them. The prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 40, spoke of the sovereign Lord who would come with power, ruling with a mighty arm, but who also would tend his flock like a shepherd as he gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. And perhaps with all this talk of a shepherd who cares for his sheep, perhaps you were reminded of something else. In his account of the feeding miracle, did you notice how Mark describes Jesus making the people sit down? Verse 39. On the green grass, a rare reference in Mark's gospel to a colour. He only mentions two other colours, prizes at the end if you know what they are. Green grass. And perhaps even the still waters of the lake after the wind dies down reminds us of something. King David wrote a song about a shepherd. We know it as Psalm 23, now described by many commentators as the most famous poem ever written. King David sings of a shepherd who makes him lie down in green pastures, who cares for his needs, who leads him beside quiet waters and refreshes his soul. A shepherd who is the great guide and protector of his sheep. And who is this shepherd? King David sings, verse 1, the Lord is my shepherd. So can we see that Mark has shown us what those disciples failed to understand that day? They'd failed to recognize who Jesus really was. In the power that Jesus had displayed that day, he was revealed as the Lord of the Exodus, who is still rescuing his people and sustaining them. A greater prophet than any who has gone before, and the promised shepherd of his people, who would protect and guide them by his mighty power. But with all this talk of power, I wonder if you might just have had a different concern about these miracles. The reality of the world is that great power is not always good news. What if that power is used foolishly, or oppressively, rashly, or unwisely? Well, did you notice that this account of the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water is bookended by Mark with the memory of notoriously bad kings? Last week, earlier in chapter 6, we saw how King Herod executed John the Baptist, an atrocity that well lived up to the Herod family name. And with all these references to Exodus we've been thinking about, the pharaohs of Egypt loom large. A fearful king who ordered the drowning of Israelite babies, and a stubborn slave master who sent his chariots and horsemen in pursuit of God's people. The power that can feed a crowd from nothing and trample the waves would be a horrific power in the hands of a Herod or a Pharaoh. But in pointing us to the God of the Exodus, who saves and covenants with his people, a God who is faithful to all of his promises, and in pointing us to the Lord who is our shepherd, Mark wants us to see that Jesus is the Lord whom we can and should trust. Jesus is no Herod, and he's no Pharaoh. No one's safe around those kings. But for those who belong to Jesus' flock, King Jesus is like a shepherd who uses his mighty power to save, protect, and guide his people. You probably remember earlier in chapter 4, Mark had previously described another occasion where the disciples were on the lake in a boat, and a storm threatened to swamp them. And in light of that story, you might have thought that this time the disciples would be saying, "Where is Jesus when we need him?" And there he was, walking towards them on the water to save them. They shouldn't have been terrified. They had nothing to fear, for it was the Lord, their shepherd, walking on the water, the God of their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Exodus coming to rescue them. They need not fear any evil, for Jesus was with them. And when he got into the boat, the power of his rod and staff was there to comfort and protect them. But Mark tells us they didn't understand that. They didn't understand how what Jesus had done with the loaves had revealed his identity and mission to everyone who would see and believe. Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, who's come to save and shepherd his people. Now, it might just be me, and I've struggled with this, but I have wondered if all of that is right, why didn't Mark just say it? Why didn't he just tell us? Why not say Jesus performed these miracles to reveal that he was the Son of God, the Lord of the Exodus, and the promised Messiah? Why not directly quote from Exodus and the Psalms to make the point? He does that later in his gospel. Well, I wonder if it's in the intentional act of remembering the Lord's faithfulness and the ancient promises concerning the Lord's Son when we see the truth about Jesus more clearly. In remembering the Lord's power, his faithfulness, his love, and his mercy, we see and recognize our Jesus, our long-promised Savior, our Messiah. So as we finish today, our passage, I think, has really something very important to say to us about trusting Jesus. It's not enough to believe the right things about Jesus. The demons of hell believe he's the Son of God. And it's not enough just to listen to him. King Herod liked to do that. Rather, will we trust him with our lives, all the days of our lives? When in a crisis, like a lonely or dangerous place, or when struggling against our circumstances, perhaps even anxious about what we will eat or drink, wondering who will defend us, will we trust him? In the small and big things of our lives, will we trust him? When we face hard choices, bewildering circumstances, when we are at our wits' end, confronted with seemingly impossible situations, will we trust him? Will we trust him for the future? As King David might say, when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, will we fear no evil? Will we trust him? Well, in coming chapters, we'll see Mark showing us how the disciples did come to a clear understanding of who Jesus is. But Mark's challenge to us today is to get now what they missed then about the loaves. So will we soften our hearts to believe this? Will we wonder at King Jesus' amazing power? And will we entrust our lives to Jesus the Messiah, the one who has come to save us? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, help us this morning by your Spirit to believe the truth of your holy words. We thank and praise you for sending your Son Jesus, who laid aside his majesty to die in our place. Please soften our hearts and open our eyes to his glory, that we might trust and serve our risen King Jesus wholeheartedly all the days of our lives. For we ask it in his precious name. Amen.